You turn on the tap. You fill a glass. You do not think about it because thinking about tap water is not a thing normal brains do. Somewhere between the reservoir and your kitchen sink, an entire invisible war is supposed to have already been fought and won on your behalf. Chlorine went in. Filters did their job. The water came out the other side, certified, tested, boring. That's the deal. That's the whole deal municipal water treatment offers you. Boredom, in exchange for never having to think about what's actually swimming around in a glass of water. In April of 1993, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that deal quietly fell apart. And it fell apart because of something so small that 4 of them could line up across the width of a human hair, so tough that the exact chemical Milwaukee was using specifically to kill things in water walked right past it like it wasn't there, and so patient that it had been waiting, essentially, this entire time for someone's water treatment plant to have a bad week. I'm a physician. I did not treat this outbreak. I wasn't practicing yet in 1993, but I have spent an unreasonable amount of my adult life reading about it because it is, professionally speaking, one of the best stories microbiology has ever handed us. Not because it's scary. Scary is easy. This story is good because of what it reveals about the gap between the water is safe and the water is safe against the specific thing that's about to make 400,000 people simultaneously miserable. So let's start where the story actually starts, not with the outbreak, with the organism, because you cannot understand why Milwaukee's water treatment plant failed until you understand that it wasn't really failing at its job, it was succeeding at a job that turned out to be the wrong job. Its name is Cryptosporidium parvum, and I want you to notice something about that name before we go any further. Crypto means hidden. Scientists named this organism in part for the fact that it is annoyingly difficult to see. That's not flavor text, that's foreshadowing built directly into the taxonomy. Cryptosporidium is a protozoan parasite, a single-celled organism, not a bacterium, not a virus, its own separate branch of the tree of life entirely, more closely related evolutionarily to the organism that causes malaria than anything you'd casually call a germ. And the form it takes when it's out in the world waiting is called an oocyst. An oocyst is essentially a parasite wearing full riot gear. It's a thick-walled spore, maybe 4 to 6 micrometers across, built by evolution to survive exactly the kind of environment that kills everything else: stomach acid, chlorine, cold water, dry surfaces, time. Inside that shell are 4 sporozoites, which is a wonderful word for 4 tiny invasive worker units, each one fully capable on its own of starting an infection the moment it gets the signal that it has arrived somewhere promising. Here is the first thing that should genuinely bother you, in the fun way. This organism doesn't need much. The infectious dose, the number of oocysts required to make a healthy adult sick, is estimated by researchers to be as low as 10 to 30. Not 10,000, not 10 million, 10. You could theoretically fit a full infectious dose of Cryptosporidium on the head of a pin and still have room left over. Compare that to something like salmonella, which typically needs many thousands of organisms to cause illness in a healthy person, and you start to understand why this particular parasite treats diluted in an entire city's water supply as a completely survivable, still dangerous scenario. You swallow the water. You don't taste anything because oocysts are not seasoning. They're just there, riding along with everything else you drank. And your stomach acid, which I promise you is genuinely one of the more impressive defense systems your body owns, capable of dissolving metal given enough time, does essentially nothing to them. The shell that protects the oocyst from chlorine also protects it from you. It travels down into your small intestine, and this is the part that actually feels almost insultingly elegant. The oocyst doesn't just dissolve and dump its contents, it senses its environment, bile salts, temperature, pH, and essentially concludes, correctly, I have arrived. It cracks open and releases its 4 sporozoites directly onto the surface of your intestinal lining. Each sporozoite then does something that I think deserves more attention than it gets in casual conversation. It invades an intestinal epithelial cell, but it doesn't fully go inside, the way, say, a virus does. It sets up shop in a bizarre in-between location, inside the cell membrane, but outside the actual cytoplasm, in a specially constructed pod the parasite builds for itself. Parasitologists call this an intracellular but extracytoplasmic location, which is the phrase I genuinely love, because it translates roughly to the parasite has moved into your house, but instead of living in a room, it built its own pod attached to the outside wall using your house's own siding as material. From that pod, it begins multiplying. Asexually at first, one becomes many, over and over, in a process called merigony, and then eventually sexually, producing new oocysts that either stay local to reinfect nearby cells or get shed, fully formed and fully armored, straight into your gut, ready to leave your body and go looking for someone else's glass of water. Let's slow down here, because this is the part that actually explains the disease. Cryptosporidium doesn't cause diarrhea by producing some dramatic toxin that shreds your gut lining the way certain bacteria do. It's messier and honestly more interesting than that. As the parasite multiplies across the surface of your small intestine, it physically damages and kills the epithelial cells it's using to multiply, the very cells responsible for absorbing water and nutrients from your food. Your intestinal lining is normally covered with these gorgeous, densely packed microvilli, tiny finger-like projections that dramatically increase surface area for absorption. Under a Cryptosporidium infection, biopsy studies show that surface flattening out, microvilli shortening and disappearing in patches, like a lush carpet getting worn down to bare floor in high traffic areas. Fewer working absorptive cells means less water gets pulled out of your gut contents and into your body. That water stays in the lumen of your intestine instead, and water that stays in your intestine instead of your body has really only one way to go. That's the diarrhea. Not poison, just very literal mechanical loss of your gut's ability to do its one core job, pull water and nutrients across a membrane. Because the workforce responsible for doing that job is currently being used as real estate by a parasite that, I want to be clear about this, is not doing this out of malice. It doesn't know you exist as a person. You are, from its perspective, a warm, wet, nutrient-rich environment that happened to have good plumbing. The parasite isn't trying to ruin your week. You're just unfortunately made of exactly what it needs. Fast fact. Here's a number I think about a lot. An infected person can shed somewhere in the range of 10 million to 10 billion oocysts in a single day of illness. Remember, the infectious dose was maybe 10 to 30 organisms. That means one sick person, over the course of a bad week, is theoretically capable of producing enough oocysts to infect the population of several large cities, if you could somehow deliver them all efficiently. You obviously can't. Most of them go into a sewer system, not directly into someone's mouth. But that math is exactly why a water treatment failure, rather than person-to-person contact, is the scenario that turns this parasite from unpleasant individual illness into public health emergency. Somewhere around day 2 to 10 after exposure, the incubation period is annoyingly wide, which is its own small act of parasitic strategy, since it makes the source of an outbreak much harder to pin down. Your immune system finally clocks that something is wrong. Here's the honest version of what happens next, and I want to give your immune system some credit here, because in this particular fight, it mostly does its job well. Cells lining your gut detect damage and distressed neighbors and start recruiting help. Intraepithelial lymphocytes, natural killer cells, and eventually a coordinated adaptive immune response involving T cells move in. In a healthy adult, this response is generally sufficient, not to prevent the illness entirely, but to bring it to an end. Most healthy people clear a Cryptosporidium infection on their own within 1 to 2 weeks, unpleasant as that fortnight may be. Watery diarrhea, cramping, low-grade fever, the whole uncomfortable package, followed by a full recovery and no lasting damage to the gut. I want to pause on that actually, because I think it's the single most underrated fact of this entire disease. For the overwhelming majority of otherwise healthy people who got infected in Milwaukee, this was miserable, inconvenient, and self-limiting. Your body, left to its own devices, generally wins this fight. The story gets genuinely dangerous only when it doesn't have the tools to. Which brings us to the part of this story that I think about more than any other part, and the reason Cryptosporidium went from regional nuisance organism to subject of intense federal research funding essentially overnight in the 1980s and early 90s. If your immune system is compromised, and the textbook example, historically, is untreated advanced HIV infection, though the same vulnerability applies to anyone with significantly suppressed immunity, whether from chemotherapy, organ transplant medication, or other causes, Cryptosporidium stops being a 2-week ordeal and starts being something closer to a permanent, worsening occupation. Without adequate T-cell function to coordinate a real counterattack, the parasite simply doesn't stop. It keeps cycling, keeps damaging intestinal cells faster than they can be replaced, and the diarrhea doesn't resolve. It becomes profuse, chronic, and in the most severe cases, can result in the loss of many liters of fluid a day. Before effective antiretroviral therapy existed, chronic cryptosporidiosis was recognized as a leading cause of death among AIDS patients, largely through the exact mechanism you'd expect: relentless fluid loss, malabsorption, and wasting that the body simply could not keep pace with. This is medically one of the clearest illustrations I know of a general principle that I think more people should understand about infectious disease. A pathogen's danger is never a fixed property of the pathogen alone. It's a relationship. It's a negotiation between what the organism is capable of and what your immune system is capable of stopping. Change one side of that negotiation, and the exact same parasite goes from annoying weak to medical emergency, without a single thing about the parasite changing at all. Now, let's get to the actual outbreak, because this is where biology collides with infrastructure, and infrastructure, it turns out, loses. In the spring of 1993, Milwaukee drew its municipal water from Lake Michigan, treated at 2 plants, the Howard Avenue plant serving the southern part of the metro area, and the Linwood plant serving the north. The Howard Avenue plant is the one that matters here. Water treatment for something like Lake Michigan generally works in stages: coagulation, where chemicals are added to make small particles clump together into larger, heavier flocks; sedimentation, where those flocks settle out; filtration, where the water passes through sand and other media to catch what's left; and finally, disinfection, historically dominated by chlorine, to kill remaining microorganisms. That entire chain is only as good as its weakest stage, and in this case, the weak stage was filtration. Specifically, the coagulation step that's supposed to make filtration effective in the first place. Investigators later identified that the plant had switched, not long before the outbreak, to a different coagulant, and that operational adjustments around that switch, combined with unusually heavy spring runoff into Lake Michigan from agricultural land and possibly slaughterhouse waste near the water intake, likely allowed a spike in fine particulate matter that overwhelmed the filtration process. The filters weren't obviously broken. There was no dramatic equipment failure alarm. Water quality monitoring at the time, measuring something called turbidity, which is essentially a measure of how cloudy water is, showed elevated readings, but they were within or only marginally outside the standards considered acceptable at the time. Here's the sentence that should genuinely unsettle you a little. The water met the legal turbidity standard, or came very close to it, for most of the crisis. Legally acceptable cloudiness and safe from Cryptosporidium turned out to be 2 different things wearing the same number.
And then there's chlorine, the part of this story I promised you at the very beginning. Milwaukee's water was chlorinated appropriately at concentrations that reliably kill bacteria like E. coli and inactivate most viruses. Cryptosporidium shrugged it off. That thick, evolved outer shell I described earlier, the same one built to survive stomach acid, is also remarkably resistant to standard chlorine disinfection at the concentrations and contact times used in routine municipal water treatment. This isn't a case of the treatment plant using too little chlorine by mistake. It's that chlorine as a weapon was essentially the wrong caliber for this particular target. You can flood a swimming pool with chlorine and still, technically, have live Cryptosporidium oocysts drifting around in it, which is precisely why, to this day, public health guidance around recreational water, pools, water parks, treats Cryptosporidium as a special case requiring people to stay out of the water for extended periods after any diarrheal illness, because chlorine alone is not going to bail you out. So, slightly compromised filtration, functioning exactly as legally required chlorination that was nonetheless useless against this specific organism, and an intake drawing from a lake that had just received a spring's worth of runoff. Multiply that combination across an entire city's drinking water supply for roughly 2 weeks in April 1993, and you get what remains to this day the largest documented waterborne disease outbreak in United States history. Fast fact. The estimated number of people sickened, roughly 403,000, came from later epidemiological modeling based on surveys of the population, pharmacy sales of antidiarrheal medication, and hospital records, not from a simple case count, because the overwhelming majority of people who got sick never got formally tested or diagnosed with cryptosporidiosis specifically. They just had a genuinely awful week of diarrhea, assumed it was a stomach bug, and wrote it out. That's part of why the outbreak wasn't identified immediately. It looked at first like an unusually large but otherwise unremarkable wave of ordinary gastrointestinal illness, until pharmacists started noticing they were completely selling out of antidiarrheal medication across the entire metro area at the same time, which is exactly the kind of unglamorous, non-microscope-based clue that often breaks these cases open before the lab work catches up. True or false? Boiling your water is the only reliable home defense against something like this, and standard home filters are useless. Verdict: partly true, partly false, and the details matter enormously. Reality: boiling water is in fact extremely effective. Heat reliably inactivates Cryptosporidium oocysts, and public health authorities during and after the Milwaukee outbreak specifically advised residents to boil tap water for drinking, brushing teeth, and even washing produce during the crisis. But the claim that ordinary filters are useless isn't quite right either. The issue during the outbreak wasn't that filtration as a concept fails against Cryptosporidium, it's that the specific filtration happening at the plant at that specific moment wasn't performing at the level needed to reliably remove particles in the size range of an oocyst. Properly functioning, well-maintained filtration, especially newer technologies developed and mandated in the years after Milwaukee, can be highly effective at physically straining oocysts out of water, since, and this is the elegant part, you don't actually need a chemical that kills the organism if you can simply prevent it from ever reaching the tap in the first place. Filtration and disinfection solve different halves of the same problem, and Milwaukee's failure was fundamentally a filtration failure being covered for unsuccessfully by a disinfection step that was never designed to catch this particular threat. The human toll extended well beyond 400,000 cases of misery. Public health investigations later linked over 100 deaths to the outbreak, overwhelmingly concentrated among people with severely weakened immune systems, patients with AIDS, transplant recipients, the elderly, and others for whom the immune system generally wins this fight in 1 to 2 weeks simply wasn't true. It's worth sitting with that fact for a second. The exact same contaminated water supply produced 2 entirely different diseases depending entirely on who drank it. For most of Milwaukee, it was an unusually bad forgettable stomach bug. For a specific immunologically vulnerable subset of the same city drinking from the same taps, it was lethal. The outbreak triggered a fairly dramatic shift in how American water utilities are regulated. In the years that followed, the Environmental Protection Agency introduced and strengthened rules specifically targeting Cryptosporidium and other chlorine-resistant pathogens, the Interim Enhanced Surface Water Treatment Rule and its successors, requiring utilities using surface water sources to demonstrate through more rigorous filtration performance standards and monitoring that they could actually remove these organisms rather than simply assuming that meeting older turbidity and chlorine benchmarks was sufficient. Milwaukee itself rebuilt significant portions of its water treatment infrastructure. In a strange, unintentionally fitting bit of medical irony, the crisis that first taught much of the American public health establishment to take Cryptosporidium seriously arrived in the same era that HIV and AIDS were teaching clinicians in painful real time just how dangerous this organism could be in immunocompromised patients. 2 separate crises independently converging on the same, previously underappreciated parasite.
Here's the part of this story that I think surprises people the most, and it's genuinely one of my favorite quiet ironies in infectious disease medicine. For decades, there was no reliably effective drug treatment for cryptosporidiosis. None. You could correctly diagnose the infection under a microscope, understand precisely what the parasite was doing to the intestinal lining, and still have essentially nothing pharmacological to throw at it directly. Treatment for most of this outbreak's history meant supportive care, aggressive rehydration, replacing lost electrolytes, managing symptoms, and for otherwise healthy people, simply giving the immune system time to do what it was already going to do on its own. It's a strange thing to sit with as a physician. The most important intervention available for the vast majority of Milwaukee's 400,000 cases wasn't a medication at all. It was water. Ironic, obviously, given the source of the whole disaster, but rehydration, replacing exactly the fluid the parasite was preventing your gut from retaining, was doing more clinical heavy lifting than anything in a pill bottle.
Nitoxazanide eventually emerged and gained approval as a treatment option, and it does show meaningful benefit in immunocompetent patients, shortening the duration of illness. But here's the genuinely frustrating twist. The one that made this parasite such a devastating problem in the AIDS epidemic specifically. Nitoxazanide's effectiveness depends substantially on the patient having a functioning immune system to work alongside. In patients with severe immunosuppression, precisely the population for whom this infection was most dangerous, even lethal, the drug's benefit is considerably diminished. Which means the actual most effective treatment for the most dangerous cases of cryptosporidiosis historically wasn't a drug aimed at the parasite at all. It was restoring the patient's own immune function, in the case of AIDS patients through effective antiretroviral therapy, so that the immune system could finally do the job the medication alone couldn't do for it. You weren't curing the infection directly, so much as giving the patient's own defenses back their weapons and stepping out of the way. I find that genuinely humbling professionally. Sometimes the most sophisticated intervention medicine can offer isn't a new molecule. It's restoring a system that already knew how to win and simply hadn't been allowed to. Fast fact: Cryptosporidium oocysts can survive for weeks to months in cold water, and studies have found them capable of persisting even in seawater and in moist soil, which is part of why it's not just a developing world sanitation problem. It's been documented in outbreaks across recreational water venues, farms, and municipal systems throughout wealthy countries with excellent infrastructure. This isn't a parasite that requires broken sanitation infrastructure to succeed. Milwaukee had, by global standards, an extremely well-funded, professionally operated water system. It failed anyway, briefly, at exactly the wrong moment against exactly the wrong organism. I want to step back for a second because I think the individual mechanisms, the oocyst, the epithelial cells, the microvilli, can obscure the more interesting big-picture story, which is really about two systems that were never actually designed to fight each other directly. Municipal chloramation was developed historically to defeat bacteria and viruses, organisms with fundamentally different structural vulnerabilities. It is, for that job, spectacularly successful. Chlorination is one of the great underappreciated public health triumphs of the 20th century, responsible for a staggering decline in waterborne bacterial disease. Cryptosporidium, meanwhile, evolved its oocyst wall for an entirely different purpose, surviving the gut of whatever animal it needed to pass through and surviving the outside environment between hosts, long before human chlorination existed as a concept for it to specifically resist. It's not that the oocyst evolved to beat chlorine, it's that the oocyst's ordinary, ancient survival tool happened to work against a human chemical intervention it had never previously encountered. That's the part that I think reframes the whole story, from a scary superbug outsmarted us into something closer to the truth. Two systems, one built by engineers and one built by 3 billion years of evolutionary trial and error, turned out to be optimized for slightly different problems, and nobody found out exactly how different until a lake had a bad spring.
Fast fact: There are multiple species within the genus Cryptosporidium, and while C. parvum and C. hominis are the two most commonly implicated in human disease, various species show a degree of host specificity. Some circulate primarily in cattle, others in birds, others largely restricted to humans, though cross-species transmission, particularly from cattle to humans through contaminated water, is well documented and is part of why agricultural runoff is treated as a genuine risk factor for water sources, alongside human sewage contamination. True or false? Since Cryptosporidium is a stomach bug, it must spread mainly the way food poisoning does, through spoiled or undercooked food. Verdict? False. And this is actually one of the more clinically important misconceptions because it affects how people think about their own risk. Reality, the dominant route, historically and epidemiologically, is fecal-oral transmission through water, drinking water, recreational water, and yes, sometimes food that's been contaminated by water or by an infected handler who didn't wash their hands adequately. Daycare centers, in fact, are recognized as one of the highest risk settings for person-to-person spread, for reasons that will surprise absolutely no parent. Toddlers are not, as a demographic, known for rigorous hand hygiene, and an infectious dose measured in the low tens of organisms is trivially easy to transfer around a room full of small children who share toys, surfaces, and apparently everything else. Public pools and water parks represent the other major modern transmission setting, precisely because of that earlier point about chlorine resistance. A single infected swimmer having what public health officials delicately call a fecal incident in a pool can seed a chlorinated body of water with infectious oocysts that remain viable for days, unaffected by chemical levels that would comfortably kill nearly everything else swimming around in there with you. I think it's worth spending a moment on how investigators actually pieced the Milwaukee outbreak together, because the detective work is, honestly, as interesting as the parasitology. Nobody woke up one April morning and diagnosed a citywide Cryptosporidium outbreak from a single patient sample. It emerged the way most large outbreaks do, sideways, from a pile of small, individually unremarkable signals that only became alarming once someone noticed they were all pointing the same direction at the same time. Local pharmacies reported unusual, near-simultaneous sales of anti-diarrheal medication across multiple neighborhoods. Hospitals and clinics began seeing an unusual volume of patients with watery diarrhea, more than would be expected for a typical spring week, clustered specifically among people served by one of the city's two water treatment plants, rather than evenly distributed across the whole metro area. That geographic clustering, Howard Avenue's service area lighting up while Linwood stayed comparatively quiet, was one of the single most important clues in the entire investigation, because it pointed epidemiologists toward the water supply as a shared exposure long before laboratory confirmation of the organism itself was complete. Stool samples eventually confirmed Cryptosporidium oocysts under microscopy, and retrospective examination of water filters and stored samples from the treatment plant helped confirm the organism's presence in the treated water itself, not just downstream in sick patients. But the practical trigger for the public health response, the city issuing a boil water advisory on April 7, 1993, came before every piece of that puzzle was fully assembled, because in outbreak medicine, waiting for perfect certainty is itself a decision, and often the wrong one. This is a principle that shows up again and again in the history of epidemiology, going back to John Snow removing the handle from a London water pump in 1854 based on a map of cholera cases rather than a confirmed microbiological mechanism, which nobody would have at the time because germ theory itself hadn't been established yet. Milwaukee, more than a century later, with vastly more sophisticated tools available, still ultimately depended on that same fundamental move: notice the pattern, act on the pattern, confirm the mechanism afterward. So here's what I actually want you to take away from all of this, because I promised you real lessons rather than the generic wash your hands advice you've heard 1,000 times. Though for what it's worth, washing your hands remains an excellent idea for reasons entirely unrelated to this specific story. First, the water met safety standards, and the water is safe against this specific organism are not automatically the same sentence, and that gap isn't a conspiracy or a scandal. It's the honest, unglamorous nature of regulation, which is always written in response to yesterday's threats and constantly playing catch-up with organisms that don't read the regulations. Standards get better after events like Milwaukee, specifically because events like Milwaukee happen. That's a genuinely uncomfortable but true fact about how public health infrastructure improves. Second, if you are ever traveling, camping, or in a situation involving water of uncertain treatment quality, a boil water advisory, backcountry water sources, international travel to areas with less robust infrastructure, remember that this is one of the specific situations where boiling genuinely outperforms casual filtration, and where "the water looks clear" assessment tells you nothing useful, because clarity and cyst content are almost completely unrelated variables. Third, and this is the one I actually think about most, if you are ever managing your own health or caring for someone with a significantly weakened immune system, someone in active chemotherapy, someone with advanced HIV, an organ transplant recipient, ordinary environmental exposures that would be a forgettable inconvenience for you can represent a genuinely serious risk for them. That's not a reason for panic. It's a reason for the kind of quiet, practical caution that experienced caregivers develop instinctively, being a little more careful about untreated water, unpasteurized products, and recreational water exposure, not because the world is secretly dangerous, but because the danger of a given organism was never a fixed property of the organism. It's a property of the relationship between that organism and the specific immune system standing in front of it. And finally, I want to leave you with the thing that keeps this story for me in the fascinating category rather than the terrifying one, 400,000 cases in all. Nothing about this outbreak required anyone to be careless, malicious, or incompetent.
A water utility followed the rules that existed at the time. A treatment process worked exactly as it was chemically designed to work, against exactly the organisms it was designed to defeat. A parasite did precisely what 3 billion years of evolutionary pressure built it to do, with no awareness that a city existed on the other end of its journey. The failure wasn't a person, it was a gap. A narrow, specific, previously underappreciated gap between what disinfection could do and what filtration needed to do. And that gap got closed, permanently, largely because Milwaukee found it first, publicly, painfully, and on the record, so that nobody else's water utility had to find it the same way. That's really what medicine becomes once you understand the hidden rules underneath it. Not a fortress protecting you from an endless, faceless horde of invisible threats. A running list of extremely specific gaps, found the hard way, one outbreak at a time, closed a little more permanently each time somebody writes the story down properly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.